One of the most common questions asked across social media about camera gear is, should I get a full frame camera, or do I go for APS-C, and is APS-C as good as full frame? Which one is better? The short answer is they both have their advantages and disadvantages depending on what you would like to do with it. For example, a decade or so ago, yes, there was a distinct difference in noise in images taken with a crop frame sensor, because as we know, a full frame sensor being larger means for the equivalent amount of megapixels, those pixels on a full frame sensor will be larger and therefore will gather more light. Technology has advanced so much over the last decade that it has really narrowed the gap. And whereas the gap, like for like, a decade ago was 1.5 stops difference or more, now it's well under 1 stop, half stop difference, and you would get the same amount of noise. Really, it's too close to call. And in a finished product which has been processed correctly, and whether it's printed to for a wedding album or for a poster print on the wall, the average person would not notice any difference whatsoever. In fact, you probably wouldn't notice any difference whatsoever. When you photograph a wedding, the happy couple don't look at the photo and think, ooh, if you'd have gone full frame, there'd have been a bit more background blur. They are concerned with the images. The only people concerned with a fraction more background blur are pixel peeping photographers who have nothing better to do. Rather than concern themselves with the art of photography, they're simply concerned about the gear. And no matter what it is, if you enlarge things enough and scrutinize like for like, you can find advantages and disadvantages. These videos are not about better photography. They're about selling photo gear. They are about making you feel that your gear is inadequate and that you should sell it and buy the latest and greatest. Well, I completely disagree, because I would happily shoot a wedding with this D700, 12 years old, hundreds of thousands of clicks on the clock. Absolutely fine. No problem whatsoever. I don't need more megapixels. I don't need the latest and greatest. I do have the D850, but there's no way that I would shoot hundreds and hundreds of images with that, because when I start downloading them to the PC, it literally cries for mercy, and I don't need that sort of resolution for what I do. Not that I'm a professional. I've shot weddings for friends and so on, although I won't do them anymore, because the days of people looking down the aisle, watching the elegant bride walking up the aisle, all with that lovely look on their face, are long gone. Now all people do when she's walking down the aisle is stand there like this and spoil the photos for the happy couple forever. And I cannot abide that, but that's another matter. So going back to the cameras. Now, there are certain times where the actual ability to open up a lens more is not required by a professional. Because even on a full frame camera, even if a professional has a 2.8 zoom, more often than not, if they're shooting people, I'm not talking about a set studio portrait, but if they're shooting people, they'll probably shoot at f4, not 2.8. Because if those people are not all on the same focal plane, there's a real risk that one of them may be slightly out of focus, which will spoil the photograph. So they'll more often than not shoot at f4, whereas on an APS-C camera, you can shoot at f2.8 and get the same depth of field. Now, there are times where the shallower depth of field on a full frame camera can work against you. For example, in landscapes, for the equivalent focal length and f-stop, you will get more deeper depth of field on an APS-C camera than you will do on a full frame camera. There are absolutely no advantages whatsoever shooting landscapes with a full frame camera. Now that you are able to get crop frame sensors with very high resolutions, should you require more than 24, which will probably be in extreme cases, because that really exceeding 24 megapixels is specialist really, because it would have to be for a purpose, because you really wouldn't need them. But on a crop frame sensor with a wide lens, stop down to f8, you have the landscape in focus from a few feet away all the way through to infinity, giving you a beautiful landscape image with almost all of the image being in focus. So in that respect, there are advantages. If you are a wildlife photographer, once again, the pixel density gives the advantage to crop frame sensors. If you are a wedding photographer or you walk around with the cameras all day long, one of the main reasons a lot of photographers have switched from big DSLR beasts to mirrorless cameras, be they Fuji or be they some of the other ones, is lighter weight. And even though Nikon and Canon have released mirrorless cameras that are really negligible, the difference between the size between the Fuji and the Nikon Z7 is negligible. It's about the same size, just a bit thicker really. But once again, for a full frame sensor, you can't bypass the laws of physics, and the lenses have to be bigger. So there is an advantage to the crop frame sensor with that regard, because if you're lugging around two cameras that with big lenses weigh several kilos each for hours and hours, it's not a joke. So every kilo you can save does make a big difference. With regards to the depth of field, crop frame sensors have the availability of lenses that can match depth of field like for like. For example, Fuji has released a 50mm lens that's f1, which will give a similar background blur to a 51.4. There are times when you cannot mitigate that difference in background blur. For example, the 24 to 70 zoom lens. It's 2.8, whether it's on crop sensor or full frame. You can't get a 18 to 50 crop sensor lens that is f1.8. So with regards to background blur on a standard zoom, the full frame sensor will always have the advantage over the crop frame sensor, because there is no faster option. There is another difference which I have mentioned, and many people do not understand this, and that is compression. That is something that you cannot mitigate with a different lens on a crop sensor camera. If I am shooting a portrait, a headshot, I prefer to use a full frame camera because I love the compression of the 85mm lens. It's not called the beauty lens for nothing. Now, many crop sensor fans or owners would argue, yes, but it's exactly the same if you switch to a 56mm lens and just to give you the same field of view, if you like, effective from the same distance. Yes and no. And the best way that I can explain this is as follows. If you had a line of trees or cars or posts, and let's take the trees, and they were 10 feet apart, and you took a photo with the trees leading away from you with an 85mm lens, because it magnifies the image slightly, it would make those trees seem closer together. If you took that photo with a 50mm lens, it would be roughly as the eye sees it. And if you were to take it with a 35mm lens, the furthest tree away from you would look much further than what it actually is. That is the lens compression. So let's go back to the 50 versus the 85. If you were to take a photo of those trees on full frame with an 85mm lens and get that person to stand, say, 4 feet away from you, and then you were to switch to a crop sensor camera with a 56mm lens and get that person to stand at the same distance so that they are framed up, the image of the person might look about the same. The trees would not, because with the 85mm lens, it would compress the trees. But that compression also applies to the person's face, only slightly, but the 85mm lens, especially when you're talking about a headshot for business shots, that sort of thing, does have an improvement in terms of beauty. Hence the reason it is called the beauty lens, especially if you're photographing women. It makes their noses appear slightly smaller. It's just the ratio, the way that the image of the face is portrayed, it does improve things. And simply switching to a wider lens to make up for the narrower field of view doesn't actually equal the same compression. And if you take in mind the example I gave with the trees and you try that, if you do have an 85 and a 50, a crop and a full frame sensor, please do try that and you will see what I mean. If you look at the trees, that will explain what I mean by compression, because many people seem to think that a 50 on a crop frame sensor framed up the same is exactly the same as an 85 on a full frame sensor. It is not. And by the same stroke, you move up to medium format, where you would have an even longer lens. The rendering of the image, especially for portraits, is completely different. It is superior by far. And that does seem to improve when you move up to large format, be it 4x5 or 8x10. Hence the reason that even now, for important portraits, many photographers do use medium format or even large format. It is the compression of the lens, the fall off in focus. It is not the same. It's not to say that it is worse, but for me, the only time that I feel that I want a full frame camera to suit my needs is for a headshot, a close-up portrait, because I like to use the 85mm lens. And even though I could use the 85 on a crop sensor and stand further back, I would have to be so far back that it's too far to maintain the connection with my subject. They're too far away. I like to be close so that I can maintain a connection with them to get the expression that I really, really want. That's my thought on the subject. Once again, as I said, it's not a case of which one is better. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, so much so that I still have both, and I wouldn't be without either, depending what I'm doing. One thing is for certain, in my case, if I'm out walkabout, visiting traveling or visiting an interesting location, I'd rather be walking around with my Fuji with a wide lens than be walking around with this tank. It's just too heavy, too conspicuous. When you point this in people's faces, you normally get a very bad reaction. Whereas with the crop sensor camera, it's so much easier to be discreet. And when you're on the street, being discreet is the key word to keep you from attracting attention and ultimately possibly to keep you safe. I hope that that this does help. If you do have any questions, by all means, feel free to get in touch, and please feel free to express your thoughts, agree, disagree in the comments. As always, it's all about opinion. In the end, get the camera that suits you.